Hello, my name's Mark Lewis and I'm Curator at Tenby Museum and Art Gallery. We're currently closed and we hope to reopen in September. However, I thought I would take this opportunity to take you on a short tour of 10 of our finest artworks from the museum's collection. We hope you enjoy the tour. Thank you. Our first work is Tenby from Northcliffe by William Golding, and that's not the William Golding of Lord of the Flies frame. This is the earliest oil painting in the collection of Tenby Museum and Art Gallery, dating from 1799. This curving, sweeping, slightly stylised panoramic view of Tenby is painted from what is today known as Northcliffe and is the location of superior properties. The painting shows the extensive Georgian buildings of the town and the spire of St Mary's Church towers over the town. You will note that there are no buildings on St Catherine's, the fort coming almost 70 years after the painting was executed. Eagle-eyed observers will note nude bathers on the beach, before the laws of modesty were imposed upon the town. The picture also shows bathing machines on the North Beach. Goscar Rock stands central here. Bathing machines gained popularity in the 19th century when sea bathing was encouraged for health-giving reasons. There were strict regulations governing the use of these machines, and they were used to protect the modesty of the bathers. Despite all laws of decency regarding the use of these machines, there were still those who took advantage of the situation and continued to bathe nude. In the 1850s, a lady visitor wrote, "If gentlemen have not the good feeling to respect the modesty of the ladies, they should be compelled to do so." Very little source material is available on this artist. He was possibly born in London in the early part of the 1770s and died in 1845. As well as being a painter in oils, Golding was also known as a line engraver. The second work is this portrait of the domino players by Edward Joseph Head. This large oil painting is a firm favourite amongst visitors to the museum. Comments such as how you could just reach out and pluck the stray strands of wool from the sweaters of the two men, and similar such remarks are often overheard in the gallery when people are paused before this picture. The portrait shows two local fishermen, Mr Gutteridge or Goodridge and Joseph Curry Davis, the subject of another portrait by Head in the museum collection. Although the setting appears to be a public house, it is in fact the artist's studio on the Paragon. Edward Joseph Head was a native of Scarborough and moved to Tenby in the 1890s, where he established himself as an artist and teacher of art. He taught a young Augustus John in his Tenby art classes, and it was on his recommendation that Augustus's father Edwin permitted his son to study at the Slade School of Art in London, where Augustus soon established himself as a highly talented artist and draftsman. Head also had work exhibited at the Royal Academy, although he never achieved membership of that august institution. Head lived in Penally and died in 1937, aged 74. Our third painting is this wonderfully observed oil portrait by Anthony Devas entitled Miss Farrant. There is a story connected with this painting that involves the much-loved writer Laurie Lee, famed for his work Sided with Rosie. Miss Geraldine Lawrence, a wealthy, stylish, gifted amateur artist and generous patron of the arts, owned Little Rock House and 1 Lexton Terrace in St Julian Street, Tenby. She commissioned Devas to paint portraits of her two nieces, Susanna and Bridget Farrant. Becoming very fond of Devas and his wife Nicolette, who was the sister of Caitlin McNamara, who was to marry Dylan Thomas, and whom Devas had met at the Slade School of Art, she allowed Devas, his family and friends to use Little Rock House for holidays. Devas's closest friends included Laurie Lee and his wife Catherine Francesca Polge, as well as John and Alison Ward and Norman and Gillian Heppel. We shall be looking at John Ward later on. The Lees recalled their holidays as some of the happiest times they had ever experienced. Locals remember Laurie Lee sitting cross-legged on the forecourt of Little Rock House, an ever-present glass of Rioja by his side, either playing the violin or tin whistle for hours on end. Memories and events of the holiday were recorded by all the visitors in a large book, which became known as the Holiday Book. Laurie Lee contributed a poem to this book, which was recorded by John Ward. Entitled Pembroke Evening, July 1951, it immortalised Catherine and Geraldine and conjured up an atmosphere of an idyllic, lazy, halcyon evening, balmy and serene and never to be forgotten in its tranquil glory. The poem, however, was never published. Devas was well known for his portrait commissions and was influenced in his portrait work by Augustus John, whom he met via the McNamara family. He was elected to the Royal Society of Portrait Painters in 1945. As well as being a hugely respected artist, he was also a keen gardener. He won the Chelsea Best Window Box competition on a number of occasions. Never really very interested in artistic isms, he made his living through direct sales and commissions to avoid being involved in art teaching and the art schools. He exhibited regularly at the Royal Academy, to which he was elected in 1953. Anthony Devas died in 1958, aged only 47, after a number of years of ill health. Our next work is a portrait by Augustus John of the author Richard Hughes. Richard Hughes was born in Weybridge, Surrey, of Welsh parentage in April 1900. He graduated from Charterhouse and Oriel College, Oxford in 1922. Whilst at Oxford he published a one-act play, The Sisters' Tragedy, and a volume of poetry. He is credited with writing the world's first radio play, Danger, broadcast on the 15th of January 1924. At Oxford he rubbed shoulders with T. E. Lawrence and W. B. Yeats and edited Oxford poetry with Robert Graves. But his nerves were to get the better of him, and he suffered a breakdown in his mid-20s. Hughes worked as a journalist and travelled widely before marrying the painter Francis Bazley in 1932. After a period in Norfolk, they settled at Larne Castle, near to Dylan Thomas, who leased the boathouse there from Hughes. Dylan and Augustus John were friends and regular drinking partners. Richard Hughes recalled that Augustus loathed fools and bores, and who in his company felt wholly guiltless in either charge. He never spoke unless he had something to say, and with a simple explosiveness and a flash in his words, the intensity he gave to his painting, though briefer. He was the best possible company, but if ever his whole mood was silent, thunderous, the warning sheet lightning flitting across his face, then the prudent were also silent. Only children sometimes could safely break it. He also stated that John was a man in the 50 megaton range. Hughes only wrote 4 complete novels, the most famous of which is A High Wind in Jamaica, published in 1929. He was a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and was awarded the Order of the British Empire in 1946. For a time he was chair of the Welsh National Theatre, and during the Second World War he worked for the Admiralty. He was a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and in the United States an honorary member of both the National Institute of Arts and Letters and the American Academy of Arts and Letters. After the war he moved to Gwynedd in North Wales, and he died in 1976. In 2009 he appeared in the Independent's list of forgotten authors. Between the wars, Augustus John became a society portraitist of renown. His subjects included W. B. Yeats, George Bernard Shaw and James Joyce, among many others. This painting of Richard Hughes was bequeathed to the museum by Augustus John. Next we move on to a hasty pencil sketch, again by Augustus John, of T. E. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, which was undertaken at the Versailles Peace Conference in 1919. Along with fellow artist William Orban, Augustus attended the conference. David Lloyd George had stated that the conference could not be allowed to pass without some suitable and permanent memento being made of these gatherings, and the government decided to approach 2 of the most famous British artists and ask them to undertake the representation of the conference. John recalled while staying at the Hotel Majestic in France at this time, "My meeting here with T. E. Lawrence began a long friendship. He sat for me frequently in Paris and later in England. Lawrence actually enjoyed being painted and always seemed vastly tickled by the results. He habitually wore Arab costume and often accompanied the Emir Fasil, whom I painted more than once. The 2 would converse in Arabic while I worked, and sometimes that remarkable woman, Gertrude Bell, would join in. But T.E. seemed anyhow incapable of facing women, except for 1 or 2 such as Gertrude Bell and D., Augustus's muse and long-time companion Dorelia. He would talk to the latter for hours at a time, when later he used to visit us in Hampshire." John continued, "I never saw eye to eye with him about pictures, but his comments are amusing. It was his own portraits which interested him most." Thomas Edward Lawrence was born on the 16th of August 1888 at Tremaddock, Carnarvonshire. He was a British archaeological scholar, military strategist and author, best known for his legendary war activities in the Middle East during World War I, and for his account of these activities in The 7 Pillars of Wisdom, published in 1926. He had become an expert in Arab affairs as a junior archaeologist in Carchemish, on the Euphrates River from 1911 to 1914, working for the British Museum on archaeological excavations. After the start of World War I, he entered British intelligence. He served in the British military, became involved in Middle Eastern affairs, and playing a key role in the Great Arab Revolt. He was a staunch advocate for Arab independence. After the war, Lawrence joined the Royal Air Force under an assumed name, T. E. Shaw. In his quest for anonymity, he had his name officially changed. Lawrence died in a motorcycle accident on May 19, 1935, in Cloud Hill, Dorset, England. Our next work is the first of two works by Gwen John we shall be looking at, this one being another firm favourite amongst our visitors, Portrait of Winifred John by Gwen. This delicate and beautifully observed oil, executed in around 1900, shows Gwen's younger sister. They had an especially close relationship, particularly when they were growing up in Tenby. During their childhood they would spend many hours together exploring the Pembrokeshire countryside to escape the confinement of their home. Winifred often appeared as a model in Gwen's work, and this painting clearly shows the closeness of their relationship in the warmth of the portrait. The work highlights perfectly Gwen's fine sense of tone, as her talent had been described by Whistler while she was at the Slade School of Art. Winifred was born in 1879, 3 years after Gwen. She too escaped the cloying atmosphere of the family home in Tenby when she was 18. She went to live with her brother and sister in Fitzroy Street in London, where she studied the violin. When Gwen went to France, she stayed with her for a short period. Despite an inherent shyness which she never lost, Winifred also loved to travel, having the same wanderlust as her siblings. Her other brother Thornton became a prospector in America. In her early 20s, when society still frowned upon women travelling alone, she crossed the Atlantic to stay with Thornton, who was working as a prospector in America. By the summer of 1905, she had reached Montana and stayed for some months with her brother, surrounded by Indians and rattlesnakes and wild animals. They planned to travel to Mexico by boat along the Mississippi, but abandoned this idea. Instead, Winifred travelled to Vancouver and on to San Francisco, a city that she did not take to. Like her sister, she supported herself with her creative talents, teaching violin or playing in theatrical orchestras. For a number of years she gave violin lessons in California, finding in every day freedom and adventure. In January 1915 she married one of her pupils, Victor Lord Shute, a failed painter who had turned to engineering and worked mostly for the growing railroads. They had 3 children, with a fourth being stillborn in 1924. Winifred died in Martinez, California, on the 12th of April 1967, aged 87. The next work is Landscape at Tenby with Figures, an early oil painting by Gwen John. Gwendolyn Mary John was born on the 22nd of June 1876 in Haverfordwest. She was the second of 4 children to Edwin and Augustus John, with Thornton being the eldest, Augustus born in 1878 and Winifred a year later. It was their mother who encouraged her children to draw and paint, Augusta being a talented artist herself. When she died in 1884, Edwin moved his young family to Tenby. Gwen attended the Slade School of Art in 1896, where Augustus had already been studying for a year. She revelled in the newfound sense of freedom she felt in London. However, when she finished at the Slade, she was eager to move on to study at Whistler's new art school, the Académie Carmen, in Paris. On her return to London, Gwen worked and lived in Bloomsbury and Bayswater, but those years she later came to term as unpleasant, and as soon as she could she left the country and her family behind. Initially leaving to go on a sketching pilgrimage to Rome with Dorelia McNeill, later Augustus John's long-term partner, in 1904, Gwen moved permanently to live in France, first in Paris and after 1913 in the suburb of Meudon. When first in Paris, Gwen earned a living posing for other artists, including Auguste Rodin, with whom she had a passionate affair. Once living alone in France, Gwen became increasingly reclusive. In 1913 she converted to Catholicism and moved to Meudon. She is quoted as saying, "My religion and my art, these are my life." Gwen died in Dieppe in 1939, which she had visited for an unknown reason. Landscape at Tenby with Figures is one of the earliest known paintings by Gwen John, executed in 1896 when she was 20 years of age. It portrays a beach at Tenby, the harbour as backdrop, with several figures including a mother with her children and a dog and a young man, possibly walking alone, possibly as part of the family, in quiet contemplation. A twilight is implied as the sun casts a golden light on the harbour as the shadows fall. In the foreground, the centre of the picture, walk 2 figures, a young lady in an elegant black coat and a younger girl who gazes up longingly at her older companion. The older of the 2 is Gwen's sister Winifred. The young girl is probably a model, maybe someone known to Gwen, maybe a stranger. They were always children on the beach, and both Gwen and Augustus chose models from among them to sketch. A relationship of closeness between the 2 figures is implied. Whilst in Tenby, the only freedom that the children had was to be found in the outdoors. The house was overseen by their father, and he was a strict disciplinarian. Gwen had converted an attic space into a mock studio where she drew local boys willing to have their portrait painted. Gwen had an ineluctable need to draw. A copy of Keats's poetry on display in the museum shows an impromptu portrait sketch executed by Gwen on the frontispiece. It is likely that Landscape at Tenby with Figures was painted whilst Gwen was at the Slade. Landscape at Tenby with Figures is not a typical Gwen John picture and is almost unique in her body of work. Traditionally, her work is associated with interiors of empty rooms, portraits, nuns, cats, and still life. It would not be a picture instantly attributed to Gwen John. Apart from its early date, the picture holds fascination in this difference to her more recognisable work. Later works show that Gwen was not so much inspired by the landscape, but by the landscape of the soul, trying to capture a tranquility in her work that she may not have felt within herself. We move on now to a watercolour on paper, Bay of Caldi, by David Jones. David Jones was born in London in 1895 to a Welsh father and an English mother. He always felt a close affinity with his father's Welsh-speaking people. He exhibited his first work, a drawing of a lion, at the age of 8. After attending the Camberwell School of Art, Jones enlisted in the 15th London Welsh Battalion, Royal Welsh Fusiliers. During the First World War, Jones saw active service in France and Belgium, being seriously wounded during the 1916 assault on Mametz Wood. His wartime experiences formed the basis of his book In Parenthesis, published in 1937, regarded by T.S. Eliot as a work of genius, and in which Jones described the assault at Mametz as the trembling woods are vortex for the storm. In 1919, Jones enrolled at the Westminster Art School, where he was taught by Walter Sickert. Yet he concluded that he could not reconcile his wartime experiences with the culture of an art school and remained there for only 2 years. In 1921 he met the engraver and sculptor Eric Gill, who set up a series of communities, including one at Capel y Ffin near Abergavenny. These communities were based on the spirit of the medieval guilds, such as mutual aid, maintenance of common interests and self-sufficiency, and these sentiments appealed to Jones. In 1921 he was received into the Roman Catholic Church. Jones joined the community at Ditchling in Sussex in 1922. In 1925, Jones left for the monastic island of Caldi, taking the opportunity to undertake some outdoor work. Here, over a series of visits, Jones nurtured his talents as a seascapist. He was attracted to what he called the murderously sharp rocks of Caldi's coastline. Whilst on Caldi, Jones found himself amongst friends from Capel y Ffin, including Dom Theodore Bailey, who had designed and made one of the windows of the medieval priory church in the 1920s. When he wanted to, Jones could work in the scriptorium. The monastery afforded a comfortable and harmonious haven where he could work on his pictures away from the daily grind and stresses of everyday life, and this suited Jones's rather delicate sensibilities. Jones would go on to suffer a mental breakdown in 1932 and a further one in 1947. And the poet Siegfried Sassoon, himself a veteran of the terrible events of the war, described Jones as a pathetic, helpless, seeming little man, ultra-sensitive, when he met him in 1964. The bulk of Jones's Caldi Island pictures concentrated on the island's bays and the sea. Jones found the portrayal of the sea problematic, remarking that it was difficult not to be led up various impressionistic, unrealistic and otherwise dangerous paths, or even worse, to fall back on some dead convention. Jones's first trip to Caldi lasted for 3 months, as long as his first stay at Capel y Ffin. He returned to the monastic island for 1 week in mid-August of the same year. He did not make a trip to the island for any length of time until October 1927, and these 2 years symbolised the start of Jones's prolific period for watercolour landscapes. Caldi seems like a kind of enchanted paradise for Jones, and the pictures he produced there were indicative of an artist in a process of experimentation and exploration, the preoccupation with formality displaced by growing sensitivity to atmosphere, maturing through the medium of watercolour. Tenby Museum and Art Gallery has one other work by Jones featuring Caldi Island. Tenby from Caldi Island is a wood engraving on handmade paper. Jones was a man of great humility and never sought the trappings and recognition of fame. Following his conversion to Catholicism, he regarded his artistic and poetic vocation as a form of devoted priesthood, living and working simply and alone. For the last 20 years of his life, until his death in 1974, he lived in a single room in Harrow, a type of self-imposed monasticism where he mostly pursued his work in solitude. Our next work is this ink and wash portrait of the remarkable painter Albert Alcalae, as portrayed in this drawing by the renowned Welsh artist Cuffin Williams, and it tells the story of the endurance of the human spirit. Even necessarily abridged for this session, Alcalae's was an amazing story. Art literally saved his life. Born in 1917 in Paris to Yugo-Serbian Jewish parents, Albert Alcalae was 22 years old and living in Serbia when Nazis invaded, and in 1941 he joined the Yugoslavian army. After being captured, he was a prisoner of war, enduring torture, and was transferred to a camp where, to Alcalae, the commandant seemed to be a decent man. Alcalae spoke to him about his life, his art, his girlfriend, his ambitions, and the commandant let him go. "Do you not think I like Jews?" he said to Alcalae. "I only admired your desire to live and your civil courage." Using a forged passport, he passed from Belgrade into Italy. He was once again sent to a camp in Italy where his family already were. All the while the spread of anti-Semitic hatred could not be staunched, and the Nazis started to insist that the Italians start persecuting the Jews in the same brutal manner that had seen the rise of Auschwitz and Buchenwald. A sympathetic local postmistress informed them that they were due to be sent to Dachau, and they escaped and fled to the mountains to hide from the purge. They moved from farmhouse to barn to monastery and back again, eluding the Nazis at each stage, sheltered by peasants and clergy who fed them and kept them alive until the war ended. At the end of the war they settled in Rome. Alcalae pursued his artistic dreams, having drawn extensively in the camps. He started painting frantically, and his work sold well. Here he met Vera, and they married in 1950. In the same year, Cuffin Williams drew this portrait in Rome. In 1951, as beneficiaries of a bill offered by President Truman to displaced persons, Vera and Albert, along with his parents and sister, relocated to America, settling in Brookline, Massachusetts. Albert would make regular trips to New York, where he would draw the energy and movement of the urban landscape, pictures where people remained notably absent, the steel structures and heavy industry of the American cities becoming central to his focus. In 1952 he had his first solo show in Boston. His paintings developed, landscape becoming more and more important. Later his work grew in abstraction, and he tried sculpture also. In 1960 he began lecturing in visual arts at Harvard, retiring in 1982. As time went on his eyesight failed. Even with the visual degeneration he needed to paint, but smaller in scale with larger gaps between the colours as the edges blurred. In 2007 he published a biography, aptly entitled The Persistence of Hope. He died in 2008. Aged 91. Our final work in this taster session of what the Museum Art Gallery has to offer is a beautiful drawing by John Stanton Ward of Tenby on an eggshell. It connects with an earlier work discussed by Anthony devas. John Ward, born in 1917, was a portrait painter, book illustrator and architectural draftsman. After studying at the Royal College of Art, Ward served with the Royal Engineers during the Second World War. He worked as an illustrator for Vogue on a 4-year contract before deciding to concentrate on portraiture. His time with Vogue had a long-lasting influence on Ward's art, and the quick, spontaneous drawing in pencil, pen and ink and watercolour that he was asked to produce brought out his natural talent and inspired some of his most distinctive work. He was elected to the Royal Academy in 1956, but resigned in 1997 in protest over the Sensation exhibition. This exhibition featured works from the collection of Charles Saatchi and included many works by young British artists, and most controversially featured an image of Myra Hindley made up of hundreds of copies of a child's handprint by Marcus Harvey. The BBC described it as gory images of dismembered limbs and explicit pornography. Ward also described Damien Hirst's work as ghastly muck. In 1985, Ward was awarded a CBE. Through the duration of his career, he retained the central artistic belief he had learnt at art school in Hereford, the necessity of good draftsmanship. Now the Tenby connection. Miss Geraldine Lawrence, a wealthy, stylish, gifted amateur artist and generous patron of the arts, owned Little Rock House and 1 Lexington Terrace in St Julian Street, Tenby. She commissioned the artist Anthony devas to paint portraits of her 2 nieces, Susanna and Bridget Ferrant, and allowed his family and friends to use Little Rock House for holidays. Devas's closest friends included Laurie Lee and his wife Catherine Francesca Polge, a Provençal woman, as well as John and Alison Ward and Norman and Gillian Heppel. The Lees and Wards lodged with the Devases in Chelsea at various times, and it was Anthony devas who suggested to Laurie Lee that John Stanton Ward was the ideal choice of illustrator for his book Sided with Rosie, part of which was written in his home. The Devases' most regular guests in Tenby were these 3 couples. Other books illustrated by Ward included H.G. Bates's The Darling Buds of May and Joyce Grenfell's George, Don't Do That. This lovely drawing on an eggshell undertaken by John Ward records thanks to Geraldine for the use of her house and for the happy times in Tenby. The delicate, intricate work displays the exceptional talent and creativity of the artist. We hope you enjoyed that, just a small taster of some of the works. There are plenty more to see. We look forward to welcoming you back in September. In the meantime, keep safe.